When discussing the genetic history of early America, we eventually run into some of the most persistent myths in American culture. These are not simply misunderstandings about genealogy, they are deeply rooted ideas that have shaped laws, social systems, racial classifications, and even how families remember their own histories. Many Americans still imagine ancestry as something neat and orderly. People often believe their family belongs to a single ethnic group, race, tribe, or national origin. The reality revealed by both historical records and DNA testing is far more complicated. America was never genetically isolated. From the earliest colonial period onward, populations were constantly mixing. Europeans married Europeans from different regions, indigenous communities incorporated outsiders, enslaved Africans came from numerous distinct populations and later mixed with other groups. Frontier settlements created entirely new communities whose identities often shifted from generation to generation. This presentation examines several major myths that continue to influence how Americans understand ancestry and identity. One of the most persistent myths in American genealogy is the idea of pure bloodlines. People often imagine a family remaining genetically unchanged for centuries. They envision Scottish families remaining purely Scottish, Native families remaining purely Native, or African families remaining purely African. History does not support this idea. Human populations have always migrated and mixed. Long before Europeans arrived in America, indigenous populations were exchanging genes across vast trade networks stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains and beyond. European populations were equally mixed. The English carried ancestry from Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, Norse, Norman French, Roman, and many other populations. Africans arriving during the slave trade represented hundreds of ethnic groups across West and Central Africa. Genetically speaking, every generation shuffles DNA through recombination. Even siblings inherit different combinations of ancestral DNA. The notion of a perfectly preserved bloodline simply does not exist biologically. What genealogists trace are family connections, not genetic purity. From the beginning, America was a meeting ground of multiple populations. Indigenous nations had occupied the continent for thousands of years before European arrival. Colonists arrived from England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, and many other regions. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported through the transatlantic slave trade. Free black communities emerged alongside enslaved populations. Intermarriage, informal unions, frontier relationships, and community integration occurred, despite legal restrictions. Over time, new immigrant waves added additional layers. Italians, Eastern Europeans, Chinese laborers, Japanese immigrants, Jewish communities, Middle Eastern immigrants, and countless others contributed to the genetic landscape. Modern Americans are often descendants of multiple migration streams that converged over centuries. DNA reveals these connections even when historical records remain silent. Many people assume modern racial categories reflect clear biological divisions. Modern genetics shows this is not the case. Race is primarily a social and historical construct. Governments created racial categories for taxation, voting rights, slavery laws, citizenship restrictions, and social control. DNA does not organize humans into rigid racial boxes. Instead, genetic variation exists along gradients known as clines. Populations overlap extensively. For example, two people classified as belonging to the same race may be genetically more different than two individuals placed into different racial categories. This does not mean ancestry is meaningless. Population history is real. Geographic origins are real. Genetic communities are real. However, the simplified racial categories commonly used today often fail to capture the complexity revealed by genetic evidence. One reason genealogists must be cautious is that racial categories changed constantly throughout American history. An individual listed as mulatto in one census might appear as white 10 years later and Indian 20 years after that. Different states applied different standards. Some states used blood fractions. Others relied on appearance. Others relied on community reputation. The same person could be classified differently by different census enumerators. This means historical racial labels often tell us more about social perceptions and government policies than about biological ancestry. DNA testing frequently uncovers ancestral connections that contradict historical classifications. A common myth claims that many indigenous tribes simply disappeared. What usually happened was far more complicated. Disease, warfare, displacement, land seizures, and government policies dramatically reduced many populations. However, surviving communities often reorganized, merged with neighboring groups, migrated, or adapted to changing circumstances. Families continued to pass down traditions, kinship networks, oral histories, and cultural practices. Government records often stopped recognizing these communities, but lack of recognition is not the same thing as extinction. Many tribes that were declared extinct by outsiders later demonstrated continuous community existence through historical documentation and family networks. The story is often one of survival and adaptation rather than disappearance. One of the most overlooked aspects of American history is administrative erasure. Governments frequently changed how people were classified. Indigenous individuals might be recorded as white, black, colored, mulatto, Mexican, or simply other depending on the location and time period. Some communities intentionally avoided identification to escape discrimination, removal, taxation, or violence. Boarding schools often attempted to sever tribal identities. Enrollment rolls excluded some descendants. Census practices varied widely. Over generations, these record changes can create the illusion that populations disappeared, when, in reality, the documentation changed. This is one reason genealogy and DNA analysis have become powerful tools for reconstructing lost family histories. This is one of the most important misconceptions surrounding DNA testing. Many people believe a DNA test can identify a specific tribe. In reality, commercial DNA tests compare your DNA to reference populations. These reference groups are often incomplete and unevenly represented. Many tribes do not participate in commercial databases. Others are represented by only a small number of samples. DNA can indicate indigenous ancestry and sometimes suggest broad regional origins. It can identify relatives connected to specific communities. It can support genealogical hypotheses. However, tribal citizenship is a legal, cultural, and political relationship, not merely a genetic one. DNA is a valuable tool, but it is only one piece of a much larger historical puzzle. Genealogists often treat census records as authoritative. In reality, census records are snapshots created by human beings. Enumerators made assumptions. Neighbors provided information. Families concealed information. Categories changed. Instructions changed. A census record tells us what was recorded at a specific moment under a specific system. It does not necessarily tell us biological ancestry. Understanding this distinction is essential when reconstructing family history, particularly for populations affected by racial classification laws and government intervention. One reason identity becomes so contentious is that people often assume there is only one correct answer. In reality, identity operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Your DNA reflects biological inheritance. Your family identity reflects upbringing and relationships. Your culture reflects shared traditions and experiences. Tribal identity reflects membership within a living community. These identities may overlap, but they are not always identical. A person may possess indigenous ancestry without tribal citizenship. A tribal citizen may carry little detectable indigenous DNA due to inheritance patterns. Both realities can exist simultaneously. Understanding these distinctions helps avoid many common misunderstandings. As genetic databases grow, a more accurate picture of early America continues to emerge. Researchers are finding extensive evidence of population mixing across colonial and frontier regions. Hidden indigenous ancestry appears in families that lost documentation generations ago. African ancestry appears in families historically classified as white. European origins often prove far more diverse than family traditions suggest. Founder effects reveal how small communities expanded into large descendant populations. Rather than confirming rigid categories, DNA is revealing a deeply interconnected population history. The genetic story of America is far more complicated and far more fascinating than traditional narratives suggest. The true genetic history of early America is not a story of isolated groups remaining unchanged across centuries. It is a story of migration, adaptation, survival, intermarriage, community formation, and cultural persistence. DNA testing has given us remarkable new tools, but it has also challenged many assumptions. It reveals connections where records are silent. It exposes the limitations of racial categories. It demonstrates the resilience of communities once thought lost. Most importantly, it reminds us that ancestry is rarely simple. The deeper we look into America's genetic past, the more we discover that identity is not about purity or rigid categories. It is about the countless human stories that converge to create the populations we see today.